The village of Blackwood sat on the edge of a dense forest, cloaked in perpetual mist that rolled in like a silent wave each morning. Life here was slow, almost as if time itself hesitated to move forward. At the farthest corner of this quiet settlement stood an old, weather-beaten house. Its roof sagged under years of wear, and the wooden planks that formed its walls bore the marks of countless harsh winters. This was the home of Jacob Grant and his younger brother, Elliot. Jacob was a man hardened by years of toil. His hands were calloused from cutting wood, his face weathered from hours spent tending the small patch of farmland that barely sustained them. Yet, it was not the labor that wore him down, it was the burden of caring for Elliot. Elliot, 10 years younger, had been an enigma since birth. Paralyzed from the waist down, he never spoke a word, only offering Jacob strange, crooked smiles that seemed to carry secrets no one could decipher. Their lives had always been modest. But lately, a strange unease had settled over the house. Jacob couldn't explain it, but there was something different, something wrong. It began with the chickens. Their little flock, kept in a ramshackle co-op out back, had always been safe, but now, one by one, they vanished. At first, Jacob thought it was foxes. The forest was full of them. But the odd thing was how cleanly the chickens disappeared. No feathers scattered about. No sounds of struggle. Even Rex, the family's old bloodhound, a dog known for his sharp senses and fierce loyalty, hadn't barked. It was as though the chickens had simply evaporated. "What's happening here, Elliot?" Jacob had muttered one night, sitting at the table with a bowl of thin stew. Elliot had only grinned, his pale face reflecting the flickering candlelight. His eyes, an unsettling shade of gray, seemed to glint with amusement, as though he knew something Jacob didn't. That grin haunted Jacob. He shook it off, telling himself it was just his imagination. But the feeling lingered. The chickens were just the start. Soon, other villagers began whispering about strange occurrences, a shadow seen darting between trees, animals disappearing without a trace. All the while, Elliot's crooked smiles grew wider. One night, Jacob woke to a sound, a faint rustling that seemed to come from the direction of the kitchen. He sat up, straining to hear over the creaking of the old house. The noise was subtle, almost like fabric brushing against wood. Grabbing the lantern by his bed, he made his way down the narrow hallway. The kitchen was empty, save for the usual clutter. But as Jacob turned to leave, something caught his eye, a flash of red. It was brief, almost too quick to be real. But it stopped him in his tracks. He stepped closer, his heart pounding. Hanging in the dim light of the lantern was what looked like a ribbon, a long, crimson strand floating in the air. It shimmered, swaying gently as if caught in an invisible breeze. Jacob blinked, and it was gone. He stood there, gripping the lantern, unsure of what he'd just seen. Was it a trick of the light? A stray thread from one of Elliot's old blankets? He wanted to believe it was nothing, but the pit forming in his stomach told him otherwise. The next morning, Jacob dismissed the incident as a dream, but the unease stayed with him. As he fed Rex and prepared for the day's work, his mind kept returning to the ribbon. He didn't mention it to anyone, not even the neighbor, old Mrs. Alice, who stopped by with a jar of preserves. "You look pale, Jacob," she remarked, her sharp eyes scanning his face. "You've been working too hard." Jacob nodded absently, accepting the jar and mumbling his thanks. He didn't tell her about the ribbon, nor about the chickens, nor about the strange, unsettling way Elliot's eyes seemed to follow him more intently than usual. By nightfall, Jacob had convinced himself it was nothing, but as he lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, he couldn't shake the image of the scarlet ribbon. It danced in his mind, taunting him, daring him to look for it again. And deep in the shadows of the old house, Elliot lay awake, his wide, pale eyes glinting faintly in the dark. The nights in Blackwood grew colder, and Jacob Grant's unease only deepened. The chicken coop, once lively with clucks and feathers, now sat eerily silent. By the end of the week, every single bird had vanished. Not a feather, not a track in the mud, nothing. It was as if they'd never existed. Jacob couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was happening wasn't natural. He'd checked every inch of the co-op, reinforced the wooden planks, and even left Rex to guard the area. But the old hound would come back in the morning, tail tucked between his legs, refusing to go near the co-op again. What the hell is going on here? Jacob muttered under his breath one frosty morning as he stood before the empty co-op. His breath hung in the air, misting like smoke. His hands clenched the axe he carried for protection. Though against what? He wasn't sure. The whispers in the village grew louder. Neighbors started avoiding the Grant house. Mrs. Alice, who had always been kind, now crossed the street when she saw Jacob approaching. Children, once curious about the lonely man and his crippled brother, no longer played near their yard. "It's not just the chickens. You know," Mrs. Alice had said in a low voice to a neighbor at the market. Jacob overheard as he passed. "There's something wrong in that house. I swear, I've seen shadows moving in the windows at night." Jacob forced himself to ignore the gossip. But the isolation stung. Alone in the woods, with only Elliot and Rex for company, the night seemed to stretch endlessly. And then, there were the sounds. At first, it was just the creaking of the house settling. Or so Jacob thought. But soon, he began to hear other noises, soft, rhythmic, almost like breathing. It came from the direction of Elliot's room. But every time Jacob checked, his brother lay motionless in bed, his pale face serene, his lips curled in that crooked smile. One particular night, as Jacob sat by the dim light of an oil lamp, sharpening his axe, Rex began to growl low in his throat. The sound was unlike anything Jacob had heard from the dog before, deep, guttural, almost primal. "What is it, boy?" Jacob asked, setting the axe down and reaching for the lantern. Rex didn't answer, of course, but his body was tense, his fur bristling as he stared into the shadows of the kitchen. Jacob followed the dog's gaze, his pulse quickening. At first, he saw nothing but darkness. Then, faintly, he noticed it again, that flash of crimson. It wasn't just a flash this time. The ribbon-like shape seemed to hover near the pantry, swaying gently, almost playfully. He froze. The thing seemed alive, moving as though it had a mind of its own. He stepped closer, raising the lantern. As the light fell on the strange object, Jacob's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a ribbon. It was something fleshy, wet, and glistening, with tiny ridges running along its surface, like the taste buds of a tongue. Jacob stumbled backward, the lantern trembling in his hand. Before he could react, the thing slithered back into the shadows, disappearing down the hallway toward Elliot's room. Heart pounding, Jacob ran after it, bursting into his brother's room. The light of the lantern flickered wildly, casting jagged shadows on the walls. Elliot lay perfectly still, his eyes closed as if in a deep sleep. But there, at the corner of his mouth, was a smear of red. Jacob felt the room spin. He clutched the doorframe, staring at his brother's pale, expressionless face. The crimson smear was unmistakable. "Blood. Elliot," Jacob whispered, his voice trembling. What have you done?" But there was no answer. Just the faint sound of Rex whining from the hallway. The dog wouldn't enter the room. Jacob backed away slowly, the lantern casting one last flicker of light over Elliot's face before he closed the door behind him. That night, Jacob didn't sleep. He sat by the fire with Rex at his feet, clutching the axe like a lifeline. He couldn't shake the image of that thing, whatever it was, and the blood on Elliot's lips. Something was terribly, terribly wrong, and Jacob knew he had to find out the truth, no matter the cost. Jacob could no longer ignore the signs. The crimson ribbon, the blood on Elliot's lips, the vanishing livestock, everything pointed toward his brother. The thought gnawed at him, threatening to unravel his sanity. Elliot, the boy he had raised, protected, and sacrificed so much for, couldn't possibly be responsible for the horrors surrounding them. And yet, the unease grew stronger with each passing day. Determined to uncover the truth, Jacob decided to keep a closer watch. He began observing Elliot in secret, hiding in the shadows of the house, his eyes fixed on the frail figure lying on the bed. By day, Elliot remained still, his pale hands limp at his sides, his crooked smile ever present. But at night, the atmosphere changed. Jacob started noticing subtle movements, Elliot's fingers twitching, his lips parting ever so slightly, as if whispering to something unseen. On one particular night, Jacob swore he saw Elliot's chest rise and fall in rhythm with the soft rustling sound that now haunted the house. It came from the walls, the floorboards, the very air around them, the sound of something alive, slithering, waiting. Jacob's resolve hardened. He couldn't keep living in the dark. Whatever was happening to his brother, he would uncover it, no matter how terrifying the truth might be. One moonless night, Jacob set his plan into motion. He waited until the house was silent. The fire in the hearth reduced to glowing embers. Gripping the lantern and his trusty axe, he crept toward Elliot's room. Rex whined softly at his feet, reluctant to follow. "Stay," Jacob whispered, placing a hand on the old hound's head. He didn't want to risk Rex getting hurt. Pushing the door open, Jacob stepped inside. The air was thick, heavy with the faint metallic tang of blood. Elliot lay as he always did, his pale face turned toward the ceiling, eyes closed. But something was different. The room felt alive. Jacob's breath hitched as he saw it. There, extending from Elliot's mouth, was the crimson ribbon. Only it wasn't a ribbon. It was a tongue, long, fleshy, and pulsating as it stretched across the room toward the corner where Jacob had stored a slab of meat earlier that day. The tongue moved with eerie precision, wrapping around the meat and pulling it back toward Elliot. The wet, slurping sound filled the room, echoing in Jacob's ears. He stood frozen, horror rooting him to the spot. This wasn't just some deformity. It was something otherworldly, something monstrous. As the tongue retracted, Elliot's eyes snapped open. They weren't gray anymore. They glowed a fiery red, burning with an intensity that sent chills down Jacob's spine. "Elliot," Jacob whispered, his voice trembling. "What are you?" Elliot's smile widened, his mouth impossibly stretched, revealing sharp, gleaming teeth. The tongue slithered back into his throat, and for a moment, silence fell over the room. Then Elliot spoke, his voice low and guttural, carrying an echo that seemed to vibrate through the walls. "You knew, all along." Jacob's instincts took over. He raised the axe, his hands shaking but firm. "Whatever you are, you're not my brother," he growled. Elliot laughed, a chilling sound that didn't belong in this world. The tongue shot out again, faster this time, wrapping around Jacob's wrist. It was slick and strong, pulling with a force that nearly made him drop the axe. "No," Jacob roared, swinging the weapon with all his strength. The blade sliced through the tongue, severing it mid-length. A deafening screech filled the room as Elliot thrashed on the bed, his body contorting unnaturally. The severed tongue writhed on the floor, spraying dark, viscous liquid that sizzled when it hit the wooden planks. Jacob staggered back, his chest heaving as he prepared for another attack. But Elliot was quicker. The boy, or whatever he had become, rose from the bed, his limbs bending at impossible angles. "You can't stop this," Elliot hissed, his voice a blend of human and beast. "It's already inside you." Jacob didn't understand, but there was no time to think. Elliot lunged, his glowing eyes fixed on Jacob's throat. Jacob swung the axe again, this time aiming for the head. The blow connected, but it wasn't enough. Elliot's strength was inhuman, and Jacob was no match for it. Desperation took hold. Jacob glanced at the oil lamp still burning on the nightstand. With a surge of adrenaline, he grabbed it and hurled it at Elliot. The lamp shattered, and flames erupted, consuming the bed and quickly spreading to the rest of the room. Elliot screamed, the unholy sound echoing through the house as the fire roared. Jacob stumbled out of the room, choking on smoke, and collapsed on the floor. He could hear the crackling of the flames, the creaking of the old wooden beams giving way. Dragging himself to his feet, Jacob called for Rex. The dog appeared, barking frantically, and together they fled into the night. Behind them, the house was engulfed in flames, a fiery tomb for whatever horror had taken over Elliot. As Jacob stood in the cold night air, watching his home burn to the ground, he felt no relief, only a deep, gnawing dread. The fire had destroyed the monster. But Elliot's final words echoed in his mind, "It's already inside you." The morning light cast an eerie glow over the smoldering ruins of Jacob's home. Blackened beams jutted from the ground like skeletal fingers, and the smell of charred wood and ash lingered in the air. Villagers gathered at a safe distance, whispering among themselves. None dared approach, their fear rooted not just in the flames but in the rumors that had spread about the Grant family. Jacob sat on a tree stump at the edge of the clearing, Rex lying at his feet. His hands trembled as he stared at the ruins, his mind replaying the events of the night before. The fire had consumed everything: Elliot, the house, and perhaps the unholy entity that had taken his brother. But even as the flames had roared, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that the creature wasn't truly gone. Elliot's final words haunted him. "It's already inside you." What did he mean? Jacob's thoughts churned, each possibility more horrifying than the last. Was the curse that had corrupted Elliot now a part of him? Or had it always been there, waiting for the right moment to awaken? The villagers watched Jacob with wary eyes, their whispered conversations filling the silence. He didn't care. Let them talk. None of them could understand what he had been through. None of them had seen the crimson tongue, the glowing eyes, or the monstrous form that had once been his brother. And yet, as the hours passed, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Not by the villagers, but by something else, something unseen, lurking in the shadows of the forest. Jacob's life after the fire was one of isolation. He moved into an abandoned hunting cabin deeper in the woods, far from the prying eyes of the villagers. It was small, dark, and cold, but it was shelter. He spent his days chopping wood and hunting game, trying to drown out the memories of Elliot and the horrors of the house. But the signs began to appear. At first, they were subtle. The feeling of being watched, the faint sound of rustling in the trees, the occasional flash of red at the edge of his vision. Rex, usually a steadfast companion, started growling at empty spaces, his ears pinned back in fear. One night, as Jacob sat by the fire sharpening his axe, he noticed something unusual. His hand was trembling, not from cold or exhaustion, but from an involuntary twitch. He held it up to the firelight and saw faint red lines snaking beneath his skin, like veins filled with molten lava. Panic gripped him. Was this what Elliot had meant? Was the curse manifesting in him now? He grabbed a cloth, rubbing his hand furiously, but the red lines remained. They pulsed faintly, as though alive. The next morning, Jacob tried to dismiss it as exhaustion, a trick of the firelight, but the signs only grew worse. His appetite dwindled, replaced by an unnatural craving for raw meat. His dreams were plagued by images of crimson ribbons twisting through the darkness, wrapping around him, pulling him under. And then, there was the tongue. It began as a sensation, a strange heaviness in his mouth. But one night, as he rinsed his face in the cabin's cracked mirror, he saw it, a brief glimpse of something long and red darting past his teeth. He recoiled, his heart racing, but when he opened his mouth again, everything appeared normal. Still, the seed of fear had been planted. Jacob couldn't trust himself anymore. The curse was inside him, growing stronger with each passing day. Jacob knew he couldn't stay in the cabin. Whatever was happening to him wasn't natural, and it wouldn't stop on its own. He needed answers. He needed help. But where could he go? The villagers had already turned their backs on him, and the nearest town was miles away. There was only one person Jacob could think of: Thomas, an old friend who had once been close to the Grant family. Thomas was a recluse, living on the outskirts of the village, but he was known for his knowledge of the strange and the supernatural. If anyone could help Jacob understand what was happening, it was him. The journey to Thomas's cabin was long and grueling. The forest seemed alive with unseen eyes, the rustling of leaves and snapping of branches keeping Jacob on edge. Rex trotted beside him, his movements hesitant, his ears constantly swiveling. By the time Jacob reached Thomas's cabin, night had fallen. The old man greeted him with a wary expression, his weathered face creased with concern. "Jacob," he said, ushering him inside, "I was wondering when you'd show up." Jacob didn't bother with pleasantries. He told Thomas everything, about the chickens, the crimson tongue, the fire, and the strange changes happening to his own body. Thomas listened in silence, his face growing darker with each word. When Jacob finished, Thomas leaned back in his chair, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "You're cursed," he said flatly, "same as Elliot was." "What do you mean?" Jacob demanded. "Why? How?" Thomas sighed. "It's an old curse, older than this village. It clings to bloodlines, passing from one generation to the next. Your family must have angered something ancient. And now, it's taken root in you." Jacob's hands clenched into fists. "How do I stop it?" Thomas hesitated. "You don't," he said finally. "You can only contain it. But it won't be easy. And it might already be too late." Jacob's blood ran cold. He had fought so hard to protect Elliot, to save his brother from the horrors of the curse. But now, it seemed, his own fight was just beginning. Jacob sat by Thomas's hearth, his mind racing. The idea of being cursed was overwhelming. But the old man's calm demeanor grounded him. "What do you mean by containment?" Jacob asked, his voice taut with desperation. Thomas retrieved an ancient, leather-bound book from a shelf, its pages brittle and yellowed. He flipped through it, his finger tracing faded symbols. "There's a way to trap the curse. Keep it from spreading further. But it requires sacrifice." Jacob's heart sank. "Sacrifice? What kind?" Thomas met his gaze. "Blood," he said simply. "Your blood, willingly given. It's the only way to weaken the curse's hold." The ritual required Jacob to draw the curse out and bind it into a physical form, a dangerous process that could kill him if done incorrectly. But he had no choice. He couldn't let the curse consume him the way it had consumed Elliot. He owed it to his brother to try. That night, under Thomas's guidance, Jacob prepared for the ritual. A circle was drawn on the cabin floor with salt and ash. Candles were lit, their flickering flames casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. In the center of the circle sat a small, iron-bound box, an ancient vessel meant to contain the curse. Thomas handed Jacob a knife. "You have to make the cut and speak the incantation. Once the curse manifests, I'll seal it in the box. But you need to hold it steady. If it escapes..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Jacob stood in the circle, the knife trembling in his hand. The air felt heavy, charged with a strange energy that made his skin crawl. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. Then, with a swift motion, he sliced across his palm, letting his blood drip onto the iron box. The moment the blood touched the metal, the cabin shook, the flames of the candles flared, casting the room in a harsh red light. Jacob began to recite the incantation, his voice wavering at first but growing stronger with each word. At first, nothing happened. Then, from the cut on his hand, a tendril of crimson mist began to rise. It twisted and writhed, growing thicker and more solid with every passing second. Jacob's chest tightened as he felt the curse being pulled from his body. It was excruciating, like his very soul was being torn apart. The mist coalesced into a form, long, serpentine shape with a glistening, crimson surface. It was the tongue, the same grotesque, fleshy appendage that had haunted him for weeks. Only now, it was larger, more alive, pulsating with an unnatural energy. The tongue lunged at Jacob, wrapping around his neck with terrifying speed. He gasped for air, his hands clawing at the slick, writhing mass. "Seal it," he choked out, his voice barely audible. Thomas chanted frantically, holding the box open. The tongue thrashed violently, resisting the pull of the incantation. Jacob felt his strength waning, his vision darkening, but he refused to let go. With a final, guttural cry, the tongue was ripped from his body and sucked into the box. The lid slammed shut, and Thomas quickly secured it with heavy iron chains. The cabin fell silent, save for Jacob's ragged breathing. "It's done," Thomas said, his voice weary. For now, the ritual had taken its toll. Jacob was weak, his body trembling from the strain. But the weight on his chest, the constant sense of being watched, the cravings for raw meat, was gone. For the first time in weeks, he felt free. Thomas placed the chained box in a locked chest and turned to Jacob. "You've contained the curse, but it's not destroyed. It never can be. It will always seek a new host." Jacob nodded, his expression grim. "What happens to it now?" "I'll take it far away," Thomas replied. "Somewhere no one will find it. But you must promise me something." "Jacob, never speak of this to anyone. The more people know, the greater the risk." Jacob agreed, though he knew the burden of silence would be heavy. He had survived, but at a cost. Elliot was gone, his home was gone, and a part of him wondered if he would ever truly escape the shadow of the curse. As Jacob left Thomas's cabin, the first rays of dawn broke through the trees. The forest felt less oppressive, the air lighter. Rex trotted beside him, his tail wagging faintly, as if sensing the danger had passed. But Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered. As he walked, he thought he heard a faint sound, a wet, slithering noise, like the tongue had made when it first appeared. He stopped, turning to look behind him. But there was nothing there. Just the quiet rustle of leaves in the wind. Shaking his head, Jacob continued on, determined to rebuild his life. Yet, in the deepest corners of his mind, he knew the truth. The curse might have been contained, but it wasn't gone. It would wait, patient and hungry, for the next soul to stumble into its grasp.